Okay, welcome back everyone. We're going to take this video, we're going to use this time to examine some of the more controversial, some of the more strange aspects of history that you may have heard of. Specifically, we're going to be looking at what is commonly referred to as the ancient astronaut theory, or sometimes it's just called the name based off of the TV show Ancient Aliens. So we're going to be looking at this argument and we're going to hold it up against and can kind of compare it and contrast it to what we have learned thus far in our native civilization class, especially because the ancient astronaut hypothesis itself likes to make use of a lot of ancient history, especially uh, Native American history and Egyptian history seems to be some of the bigger focuses of these episodes. And we have already talked about some of these sites. Sites in North America, like the Poverty Point culture and the Poverty Point site, as well as sites in Meso and South America, like Chichen Itza, some of the Mayan sites, as well as like the Incan capital of Cusco, oftentimes appears on these television shows. And they make particular claims about these shows in relation to this idea. Okay, so let's jump into it, right? Ancient aliens and historical truth. Is this idea a good historical argument? And by answering this question, we can also answer the inverse. What exactly makes a good historical argument? And there's a lot of things wrong with the argument. I'll go ahead and say that, reveal my cards, right? Like we've talked about in our expedition before. Um, I'm just going to touch on two things, two simple things, to kind of show you where the flaws, where the holes in this argument really are. Okay, just to review the argument again, even though we've talked about it. And there's a ton of YouTube videos out there. All you got to do is type in ancient aliens. A whole long list of episodes and clips from the show will show up. So what exactly is the ancient astronaut theory? Okay, so first and foremost, I've kind of narrowed this down a lot, but I want to make sure that I pay homage to the actual argument and do my best to support what they're trying to say, what they're trying to argue. I'm going to be super brief here, but there are the show's gone through over 10 seasons, I think it is. It's been around for a really long time. This idea, as I mentioned before, goes all the way back. I think the first major book published on this was Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, if I'm not mistaken. It's been picked up recently in the 21st century by the History Channel, and the show Ancient Aliens has really promoted this idea a lot. So much so that it's become a pretty commonly accepted idea and belief amongst people, this idea that extraterrestrials have interfered and intervened at some point in human history in the past with these ancient civilizations, right? So this is a very simple, straightforward breakdown of the argument. First and foremost, what typically happens is they will point to some sort of inexplicable event, whether this is a architectural structure, whether this is an ancient myth, whether this is an ancient artwork that seems to be depicting some sort of foreign object. They'll point to one example, such as the pyramids of Giza, or the Maya pyramids of Chichen Itza, or the Mayan observatory of Venus at Chichen Itza. They'll point to a archaeological site like that and say the existence of this site, the existence of this building is inexplicable based on what we know. Inexplicable in the sense that there is no way that the Maya or the Egyptians or whoever we're talking about, that there is no way that these people could have constructed this object. Okay. The second point is, building off of that first point, that our conventional historical narratives cannot explain these events, that conventional history cannot explain these events, that we simply do not know how the Maya built Chichen Itza, or how the Maya were so accurate with their astronomical observations. And as we've also talked about, oftentimes with the second premise, there is an air of conspiratorial thinking, that not only do we not know, but there has been a concerted effort by academics, by historians, by even teachers, to push upon people, even though we don't know, to tell them, no, this is what happened. Don't ask questions about it. That there's some sort of conspiracy amongst historians that we're going to peddle this one narrative, even though we know secretly that we don't have all of the information, right? This gets into the more conspiratorial thought regarding this idea. But that our traditional narratives just simply can't explain, whether it's a structure, whether it's a text, whether it's a painting, take your pick, right? And the third point, the conclusion of all of this is, since we have these artifacts that can't be explained, since conventional wisdom, since conventional knowledge cannot explain it, then this leads credence to the idea that these objects or writings or paintings were somehow inspired by, influenced by, or given by ancient human contact with extraterrestrials. That's kind of the baseline claim, that these people were able to, in reference to the pyramids, for the example, that the Egyptians were able to build the pyramids because of their contact with extraterrestrial technology, right? Okay, so that's the gist of it. And I think I've outlined it somewhat as an ancient astronaut theorist would outline it, right? Typically speaking, they're going to use a specific example. Like they would say, the pyramids of Giza cannot be, the construction of the pyramids of Giza are inexplicable. We do not know how the Egyptians did it. Our traditional historical narratives cannot explain how ancient Egyptians, with their level of technology, were able to construct these pyramids in the way that they're built. Therefore, it's reasonable, or one can assume, that they got some sort of outside help, and that this outside help was from extraterrestrials, right? So what is the problem with this? Why is this a weak historical argument? Or what are the problems, historically speaking, philosophically speaking? What are the issues with how this argument is structured? And you all have already identified some of the most important aspects of this in our discussion that we already had. Okay. The biggest one, the biggest objection here, from my perspective anyway, I mean, there's a lot of objections. So somebody might say, well, I think this is a more important objection. But from a purely historical standpoint, like I said before, probably the biggest sin of history, the biggest historical no-no, is what we call anachronism, historical anachronism. Big fancy word. Its meaning is relatively simple and straightforward. So what is historical anachronism? Historical anachronism is something which is out of place in history. A modern idea, concept, or technology that is either read into or placed into a historical context. Okay, so we got a few examples here. These are silly examples, but I think they illustrate the bigger, broader point, right? Technology represents probably the best, the easiest, most easiest seen example of what anachronism is, right? So you have the picture of Abe Lincoln with a boombox, or the medieval knight with a gun. What's wrong with these pictures, right? Obviously, there is a piece of technology that is out of place, a piece of technology that these people did not have access to. So anachronism is some form of the present, whether it's present technology or the present understanding of the world, or the individual who is reading or watching the history, their understanding of the world that is read into or placed into the past, right? If you were to visit the pyramids of Giza and you were to look at the artwork on the inside of the pyramid, and one of the pharaohs was depicted holding a mobile phone, right? Obviously, in your mind, hopefully, there'd be some major red flags that are coming up, right? Something obviously is wrong with that picture. Where anachronism gets a little bit more slippery, where it becomes harder to identify, is when we start to read into historical narratives, not with technology, but with, for example, ancient myths and ancient literature, ancient religious literature in the forms of ancient myths, or just ancient literature in general, in whatever form that might take. Right? This is where anachronism is harder to catch because it's a little more subtle. Okay. So this is the example that we used, right? This is an example of a Maya creation myth. It comes from the Council Book, dating to the 2nd century BC, I believe. Double check me on that. Okay. So we kind of read through this a little bit in class. And the question here is, how do we interpret this story? Or what is the best way to interpret the story? If I read this, if this is your first time reading this, right, the story might sound a little strange. Parts of the story might not make sense to you, but you have to ask yourself the question, well, how do I go about interpreting this? So specifically, look at the second paragraph there. There were makers in the sea, together called the plumed serpent. There were makers in the sky, together called the heart of the sky. Together, these makers planned the dawn of life. So if we ask the question, who are these people? Who are these makers? How do we go about answering that question? Think about this. Where would you look to answer that question? What other historical facts would you consider to answer that question? So, an anachronistic reading of this Maya creation myth would be something like the following. Well, these makers are the Greek gods, or these makers is the Christian God. This is referring to these makers, plural, refers to the Christian Trinity. What's wrong with that interpretation? What's the issue here? Or to get back to the example that I used in class, right? Let's say that I read this and I say, okay, well, what it seems to be saying is that life started in the sea, that eventually it moved from the sea to the sky, from the sky to the earth. What I really think is happening here is that we have an ancient interpretation of Darwin's theory of evolution. We know from modern day evolution that life started in the ocean, moved to the land, moved to the air. Eventually, what we have here is an ancient interpretation of that. What is problematic with that interpretation? Like we talked about in class, what's problematic with this is that we are imposing an outside interpretation, outside ideas onto an ancient document. So to go back to the Darwin example, what we are doing wrong, the anachronistic reading there that's taking place, is reading 19th and 20th century biology into a text that was written 2,000 years before Darwin was even born. Or reading one religion that didn't have any contact with the Maya into the Maya's religious beliefs. That is the harder to catch anachronism. And it happens not just with text, not just with stories and myths, But as we've also seen, it happens with archaeological evidence. All right. So this is taken from the tomb of Pakal, who, as I explained before, is the kind of political leader of the city, maybe the equivalent of a mayor, something like that. He's under the king, but he's kind of been put in charge of the economic life of the city. And this is a artistic copy of his sarcophagus, the lid that was over his tomb, right? And like we talked about in class, take a look at this picture. What do you see? What stands out? How would you interpret this? Right? Some of you said, oh, well, there's the Maya tree of life. That looks like the feathered serpent. Looks like we got some animals there. We got these faces here. But others of you said, and you, of course, kind of at the centerpiece, you have this gentleman sitting here. Others of you said, well, it kind of looks like he's sitting on something and maybe like messing with some controls there. Maybe these things down here look like pipes. Maybe he's sitting on some sort of machine, right? So within this context, what is the best way to interpret this? What is the best way to interpret Pakal's tomb? As an ancient history teacher of mine would always stress, especially when reading an ancient text or looking at an ancient work of art, we ask the question, well, what does it mean? What is the message that it's trying to convey? Or what is it attempting to show us? If you learn anything, learn this phrase: context determines meaning. Context determines meaning. So if we ask the question, what does this picture mean? According to this phrase, how do we figure that out? Well, we look at the ancient Maya world. Who was this guy? What was he responsible for? What do we see this imagery in other Maya drawings? Do we see something like this depicted somewhere else? And as a matter of fact, we do, right? We see the Maya tree of life. We see the plumed serpent. We see this headdress and fashion that this guy's wearing. We see this depicted elsewhere. So this gets into our second point. How do we weigh the evidence? This is a big question with history. I'm calling this burden of proof. So we have two claims here, going back to this picture, two claims. The first claim is that Pakal's tomb is just a depiction of Pakal, the Maya tree of life, maybe the plumed serpent, maybe some other deities thrown in there, maybe like a water canal or something like that. The other claim by ancient astronaut theorist is that Mr. Pakal here is in a flying machine. So two claims. Which one holds the most weight? Which one is more believable? And how do we determine that? So both claims, anytime I make a historical claim, what happens is I then have the burden of proof. The burden of proof is on me to support that claim. So if I'm going to say that this depiction of Pakal is him riding some sort of airship, okay, I have to support that claim. Why do I say that? What evidence is there to point to that reading and interpretation? Okay, this is where we get to the balance of historical evidence. And I want to share another quote with you that's always stuck to me because I think it summarizes this all pretty well. And that's this quote by Carl Sagan: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. anytime you make a claim in history, no matter what it is, the believability of that claim is determined by how much evidence you have to support that claim. So if I say, use any example you want to. If I say that the United States entered World War II December 7th, 1941, that's a big claim. Now, what evidence do I have to support that claim? Well, as it turns out, I have a whole host of evidence, right? So you can think of it as a scale. The more claims you have, the more weighted the scale becomes, the more believable, the more truthful that claim gets, right? So the amount of evidence for the United States entering World War II, December 7th, 1941, the evidence is overwhelming. So the truth of that claim, if we think about it in terms of like probability, is almost certainly true. It would take a miracle for that claim to be disproven, right? Going back to this tomb, which claim has more evidence? Which claim has more proof? Well, context determines meaning, right? Do we see any of these other images elsewhere? Do these other images represent something that we see in Maya culture? Is this gentleman here someone who was an important Maya figure? Well, it turns out that the answer to all those questions is yes, yes, and yes. That we see evidence of all of these, well, I can't say all of these, but we see evidence of a lot of these figures elsewhere in Maya culture, leaning credence to the idea that this gentleman is underneath the tree of life and that this is perhaps representing his journey to the afterlife. Taken with the fact that underneath this carved stone lid laid his body, which was buried there, right? So which claim is more believable? Where does the evidence point to? In this case, anyway, we have to go through each one of these claims case by case by case. But in this case, the evidence seems to overwhelmingly point to the claim that this is the burial place of Pakal and that what this represents is deeply entrenched within Maya religion and mythology and culture. Okay, I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.